Hello and welcome to the Choralosophy Podcast. This is episode 197, Ripping Off the Bandaid, Volume 2. The Choralosophy Podcast has been at the epicenter of the music education conversation since 2019. The first episode that really made a splash was number 18. It was called Ripping Off the Bandaid. It seemed to draw a two-sided coin response. Colleagues were either offended or found out that their instruction was going to be revolutionized for the better. In this episode, I look back to episode 18 to try to find which ideas presented there are still true for me, and on which points my view has shifted or evolved. Many points made in the original episode were wildly misinterpreted, usually on social media, and taken out of context. Other ideas have stood the test of time. In the last 5 years, the conversations with colleagues have been incredibly illuminating, educational, and humbling for me. It has forced me to consider the difference between circumstance and pedagogy. What is the best pedagogy for building advanced, independent, fluent musicians in the choral or instrumental classroom, for that matter? Are there any right or wrong answers? The short answer is yes, there are right and wrong answers. We know more about the way the brain acquires language fluency than we did when many of our music education methods books were written, and definitely more than when many of our quote-unquote industry norms were formed. I just got done running an updated poll to the one I ran 5 years ago and found that by and large, at least from the 300 or so folks that just ran this poll with me this last week, not a lot has changed in terms of the overall proportion of music educators in how they deliver instruction. I would say that from what it looks like in the recent polls, that teaching primarily by rote has gone down, but teaching while guiding people with the piano, guiding singers with the piano, has not really dipped. It's still in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of folks who are doing it that way. And I am going to respectfully and calmly lay out the reasons why I think you're doing it wrong. And that will offend people because I don't know how else to say it though. If I think that I've come across information about the human brain that would suggest to us that by playing notes on the piano while we're trying to teach sight reading, while we're trying to teach them to read the music, we are putting a disconnect between them and the music. And it's going to slow down their progress long term. So in this episode, I laid out the why and the how that I believe that you actually could be moving faster without the piano if you invest the time, invest the energy in the kids and trying to build their skills. So stick around. I hopefully have not turned you off already, but let's talk about this. And of course, I always want you to continue the conversation over on the Choralosopher's Facebook page. Don't forget, you can enter Choralosophy at checkout at sightreadingfactory.com. You can implement a lot of the things I'm about to talk about there. You enter Choralosophy at checkout when you get your membership and your students their membership. You can also enter the code at mymusicfolders.com, mychoirrobes.com, graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com to get a discount for you and your program. It helps the show out a lot as well. Calling all concert planners. Let's talk about Ludus. It's more than just a ticketing platform. It's a game changer for event management. Picture this: simplified ticketing, seamless marketing, powerful fundraising, and now, brand new this year, volunteer management. All for free to you and your organization. Thousands of organizations trust Ludus, and you should too. Elevate your events with Ludus. Sign up at ludus.com/choralosophy today and experience the difference. So for the rest of the episode, I'm actually going to be screen recording myself. If you are on YouTube, you're going to see me watching the old episode 18. You'll also notice that if you're listening on the audio-only version, which is the vast majority of you, that the audio quality will change, and that's probably the best way you'll keep track of whether or not we're 5 years ago or if we are today. I don't even know if I had a microphone yet back then, or if I just kept it so far away from my face, I didn't know what I was doing. So you're going to hear me talking to myself, basically, having a conversation with the 5 years ago me in episode 18. It's not going to be the whole episode 18, so I would encourage you to listen to this commentary and discussion of some of these pedagogical ideas. And then, of course, go back to episode 18. You also, since then, you will find every single bit, and there's been a lot of free resources that we've created here, specifically related to the pedagogy of teaching music literacy. And you can find them all for free at choralosophy.com/music literacy. all one word. It'll take you directly to this episode, as well as all of the recent episodes on music literacy instruction, including my blockbuster a cappella rehearsal presentation. So I strongly encourage you to listen here and then go back and try to take in the full explanation of this pedagogy. We didn't learn this stuff in college, so I'm trying to start fresh. Now, before we get too much into the weeds here of this episode and its how-to, because there will be some how-to steps for those of you who are compelled by this idea. Is it possible for my students in my situation to be a cappella sight readers all of the time? And I would say that yes, it is to any of you, no matter where you come from. But the first question we have to ask ourselves is, would you, or do you even think that's important? Which I can't make that decision for you, nor is that the purpose of this episode. This episode is a passion of mine because I believe very strongly in the power of music literacy for students. And I will go ahead and make a couple value judgments in that there are lots and lots of ways to skin a cat, as we've talked about on the show before. There is no one right way to do everything. That being said, I will make a few judgments as I see them. And of course, as always, also on the show, you're free to respond, choralosophy@gmail.com, or on the Choralosophers group. If you disagree with me, let's talk it out. But here's one of the judgments that I will make from the way I see it. If the students hear the music prior to having to sing the music, then they are not sight reading. At some level, they are mimicking, they are responding. So that's one. Okay, so I'm going to jump in and respond to myself here. So that statement that I made back in 2019, I now believe it even more strongly than I did back then. This was prior to me taking some postgraduate courses on the science of reading and dyslexia and the brain, and a lot of information that I have now gathered about how our brains work when we read. And I am now even more convinced that if we play along with kids while they are reading, then we are slowing down their ability to read fluently. Because in a very real sense, they are not actually reading. They are responding, which lights up a different part of the brain than when someone has to read and recall the noises from their own brain. So the audiation style of learning will speed up their ability to do that in the future. So when we think we are speeding up the rehearsal by playing the notes on the piano, we might be in the short term, but in the long term, we are very much slowing them down. With notes being played for them on the keyboard, they are not sight reading. They are also following along, but at quick response. And if you listen very closely to choirs that do this, the notes from the singers do come slightly after the notes on the piano, meaning it's not really sight reading. So a way I would think about that is if you had a young, new English reader in your class, or maybe your biological child that's at home like I do, trying to learn how to read English. We would sit there next to them with the C-Spot Run book, or whatever it is, and the child then reads the words slowly, but we are reading them out loud slowly with the child. We might do that as one of the preliminary steps to help them read, but we would not turn around and then say, good job, you read the book, because they didn't read the book. They followed along with a guide, right? So the question is, if you could wave a wand at your classroom and fill it with readers, true readers, meaning they are not getting the information played for them prior or during the exercise, would you? If you could wave a wand at your classroom and fill it with readers, would you? And I wonder sometimes, for teachers out there listening to this, I wonder if this kind of a question is really rooted in belief. Do we believe it's possible? So when I asked that question, I said, if you could wave the magic wand, would you? And of course, probably most people would say, yeah, sure, of course, that would be amazing. But then when the rubber hits the road, I'm not sure how many of us actually believe that it can be done in their contexts, partly because we are never taught how to teach these things. And we are definitely not taught how to incorporate the science of reading into our instruction. So we are not taught how the brain works when we are reading, when we are acquiring language skill. So of course it would make sense that we would develop pedagogies based on a lot of things that are maybe not science-based. And then we would go about and propagate our profession based on how we were taught and how we learned as kids. And then we take those same ideas and pass them forward. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that they are the best ideas. So I think these are really interesting things that have come up in conversations since this episode came out, but I still think that's how I would tweak that question, is not if you could wave your magic wand, would you? It's really more of a, do you believe that this is a thing that young adolescent kids can actually learn how to do? Is independent literacy, truly independent literacy, a worthy goal? Do you want that in your classroom? Forget about, for now, whether or not you think it's possible. Do you want that? If there were methods that work in order to achieve this, would you want to know? Would you want to know what they are, even if they are wildly different than what you currently do? What if it took you years to get your program to that place? Would you have the patience? If there were steps that a person could outline for you that would get you to a place where on the first day of school, a group of kids who have had your class in years past could get a starting pitch and sing 6 to 8 part a cappella music for 45 minutes without ever touching the keyboard. Would you want that? If the answer is yes, then stick around for this episode and we will talk about some hows. If you don't want that, then this is where I would get to the next bit of maybe some disclaimers. If you don't want that, I would argue that you're not teaching literacy. And we could have a conversation about scenarios and types of music making where literacy is not the goal, and those are completely valid. And we'll talk about some of those scenarios where learning to read music at sight is not the primary purpose of the learning experience at that moment in the classroom. Although I will make the statement, and I hope to defend it, that literacy should be the primary method that we use in our classrooms because of all of the other methods and ways of learning music, auditorily or visually. A music reader can be empowered to leave our purview, leave us as the teacher, and go access a world of music with no one's help. Whereas if the only method is rote or call and response, then they will always need somebody to teach them the song. And I think that our students should experience all types of literacy. Okay, so this one is probably one of the topics or the angles that got me in the most trouble when this episode came out, because I think some people heard that as, well, learning music by rote is less than, because of what I just said, which is that if literacy is the primary method because it gives skills that no other way of learning music gives, then what I'm saying is I'm making a value judgment that there is a morally superior way to teach. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying, actually, though, is that there is a neurologically superior way to teach. And if we aren't looking at that science, then this is my strong opinion, but I have strong opinions, and that's why I have a podcast. But I do think we are doing our students a disservice if we aren't educating ourselves in the ways that the brain builds skills, the way that human brains, which are really the same everywhere and for all time, they function the same way. How are we delivering our instruction that plays into the strengths of the minds of our students? And one of the things that we know about the brain, and I wish that I had gone into this more when I was making this episode, but without the opportunities for the neuron and the neural connections to be formed by repetitive action and repetitive thought, then kids don't develop expert level skill. Okay, so if the end goal is, can a kid pick up a piece of music without any help from any adult and just go figure out how it sounds? And that, when I say no help from any adult, that includes a practice track that they would play or going on YouTube to listen to the recording. All they need is a reference pitch and the piece of paper. And then they are on their own and they can truly do it themselves. If that is something that we think is a worthy goal, then we need to know how the brain develops skills like that. And one of the things that we know is that they need the chance to do it over and over and over and over. And they ideally need to do it every single day. And of course, we all wish we had more instructional time with kids. But if we have the argument that we don't have enough time for this, then of course they will. Then they won't. You won't prioritize that in your classroom to allow them to form those neural connections, and then more importantly, do them over and over again, so that the sheath, the myelin sheath, gets more insulated and more insulated over time, so that those skills become easier to the point where they are fluently reading, as in, don't have to stop and think anymore. They are just reading the music, right? And so, of course, if you are listening to this, I really don't mean to sound like I'm trying to overly academicize these things, but if you don't know what myelinating a neural pathway means, that would be an area to go and do a little bit of digging on, because I think it gives us some really great insight into how students learn. There's a great book called The Talent Code, which I've talked about on the show before, but it does a really good job of explaining in many contexts how these things happen. So some disclaimers. I know that not everybody starts in the same place. I completely recognize that. So some of you might be thinking, yeah, but with my feeder system, these are some comments I saw in the poll. I don't have a feeder system that's going to teach kids to be able to do that on the first day of school. They have no oral background. What does do, re, mi sound like? They have no idea. So there's no way we can start that on the first day of school. I still hear a lot of this. We have to teach them. And I recognize that. So in my situation, here's how I would explain it. I get kids, and this is a privilege, I get kids who, for the most part, already know the terminology. So that's how I would describe the readiness of my ninth graders. They know the terminology. And since COVID, this has changed. So, and this is probably the most important update that I will give during this episode, is that in my current context, this is, of course, was originally recorded 5 years ago. I was not even dreaming that there would be a pandemic, right, when I recorded this. Since then, our numbers of our freshmen are dramatically lower, and they come in knowing less stuff. And I don't mean they come in knowing how to sing less well. I actually think I've not seen a big change in that at all where I teach. But in terms of just knowing how to apply skills, that's been harder. And I think in a lot of ways it's because it's connected to programs that have smaller numbers of kids have less opportunities to learn from each other. And I think that's partly one of the things that's a disconnect between what I do with large choirs and what may or may not work in different contexts, like you heard me just mentioning. I'm aware that these contexts exist, and they do change how we instruct. So my classes are quite a bit smaller now than they were 5 years ago. And what I would report, though, is that these ideas still work. So even though I have maybe 22 or 23 boys last year in a tenor bass choir, they're still reading 3 and 4 part level 5 exercises by the end of ninth grade, a cappella with no help, and level 5, of course, on Sight Reading Factory, and then transferring those reading skills into actual choral repertoire that is relatively advanced now that they're in 10th grade. So, and I used to, and for reference, if 22, 23 guys in a tenor bass choir class before COVID, that would be like, 40, 45, 50. Freshman boys. So, these things your contexts will change, but that doesn't mean that the pedagogy should change. There still needs to be some core principles in our pedagogy that are based on the human brain and what we know about how the brain works. Technology for the most part. And I would say, because our school system allows kids to join choir really with no prior to high school requisites, other than they can fairly fluently match pitch. So if I go boop and they go boop, then they could make choir. That's oversimplification, but if they can match pitch, then we probably will be able to put them in a beginning level choir. So we do have some of those brand new to choir kids, but for the most part, they've come up through a feeder system and they come preloaded with what does a quarter note look like. I also get a lot more brand new kids since COVID. I will throw that in there too. That's changed. We get a lot more kids that didn't do choir in middle school at all and come to it for the first time in 10th grade, in 11th grade, maybe mostly in 9th grade if they do try it in high school, but they are coming with no quote-unquote feeder at all. And I'm also, again, noticing that these ideas work for them too. The time gets one beat, a half note most of the time gets 2 beats. They've sung scales and solfege up and down, and they kind of know the hand signs. Like if you were to ask them, show me re, they could show re. But they are not, when they come to me, able yet to simply look at a line of music and sing it with confidence. That is something they come typically not loaded with that information at all.
And
so
that's
what
still
they've
true.
learned prior is usually background knowledge that will help them with what I'm going to ask them to do at the high school level, which is great. And I know that not everyone even has that. So in other words, you're truly starting at a square one, where reading music off a page is obviously not going to be the first step for you. But reading music should still be the first step. So let's say you are at that stage where you're truly teaching from square one. Have them read your hands. Even if you're teaching them 3 or 4 notes on the first day, and you're going to go do, re, mi, and then the T below the do. And all of the patterns are going to be those 4 notes. I don't care if the kids never sung before in their life. They're going to, with 10 or 15 minutes of drilling those notes in that pattern, and with those hand signs, they will read your hands. And they will start to be able to jump between those different notes. And the process then has started. That part of their brain has awakened, you might say. So that's a disclaimer. I know that not everybody starts in the same place. And so this is not an elitist position where I'm saying that, because my kids can do it, all the kids can do it. Everybody's going to start in a different place, and as a result, will end their school year in a different place. And not everybody's has to look like each other's. The main thing, of course, is that there is a gift being given to the kids, and this is the philosophy part of this episode. I believe that's important for all kids of all backgrounds to be given the gift of literacy, and true literacy, where they don't need your help. If we can give them even a little bit of that, then they then have the tools to access music of all types of languages and cultures and backgrounds whenever they want to. And that feeling of power, I think, is something that hooks kids on choir in a way that is underestimated in the profession. I think that, a lot of focus gets put on, can we get them to smile and laugh and have fun and sound good in the first week of rehearsal or the first month of rehearsal, and that is the primary goal. And I would say that that's important. You should look for opportunities in your class period for that. But giving them the gift of being able to read the music so that they accomplished it without you is another way to prevent you from having to recruit. Because once those kids feel that power, they get hooked. They really, really do.
And again, I would say that this is still true, even though the program overall at my school has shrunk since COVID. Like I mentioned, we're getting less kids into the 9th grade, but we are also still retaining at very, very high percentages, which is what's keeping the program afloat, right? So if we get less kids in, but we're also losing a very small number of kids once they start. And again, the reason that I believe that happens in our environment is a lot of the community building and relationship building things that we all know are so important. But the other reason that they stay is because they feel good at it. They feel like they're good at it, and even if they are, quote unquote, the weakest one in the room, they still have the ability to contribute, because when they're all being taught to open the music and discover something inside of it that they can contribute, that's an extremely powerful experience and formative experience for kids.
I also recognize that there are some teachers who have structural barriers in place to keeping kids in choir for multiple years. And the process I'm going to talk through in this episode is dependent upon your ability to keep the kids in choir, because you're going to make progress. They're going to become literate within one school year. But to get to the point where I described, where you've got a group of kids coming back to you for a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th year, so they're in a more advanced class and they can rehearse that 6 to 8 part a cappella piece, polyphonic, no notes being played for them, and just have an a cappella rehearsal on the first day of school. For that to happen, you're going to have the kids coming back, because that is not a 1-year process. In fact, when we started doing this where I teach, that was a 3-year process. It was the beginning of the 3rd year that my kids could do that, because those were the kids that by the time they got to the advanced group had been doing that since they were 9th graders, and they were used to coming into the school day or the choir class and starting every single day with a cappella sight reading. And then by the time they get to the advanced group, that's just what you do. And they don't have any frame of reference for what it feels like to have notes played for them first. So they don't have that hesitation of waiting for the information before they sing. They just dive right in. So I understand that is not possible in every situation. I would still argue, though, that it's that getting the students as far as they can towards that goal before they leave you and go off into the world or to their next music class is still a valuable thing.
This also caused a lot of disconnect, because I think there is a lot of comparison, and if I can't be as good as the program down the road or the one I see on Facebook, then I'm not doing a good enough job. And I think there's a lot of sensitivity towards that. And so, for example, if I'm in a choir program that is set up structurally to where kids get very limited access to a choir experience. In other words, getting kids to be in choir for multiple years is nearly impossible because of the way that the school is set up. Well, then I would still say that you should be doing these things. We should teach music to kids in a way that allows their brain to fully form all of the connections, which means that they're doing it themselves. And that means that we're not over programming so that we can do the choral music we did in college that we fell in love with, but we're doing the music that their current literacy level is allowing them access to so that they can truly be the ones who are discovering what the music sounds like. And that is why we enjoy reading books when we're young. We enjoy discovering these stories by ourselves. And I think that we are taking that opportunity away from kids when we overprogram to the degree where we feel like in order to get ready for this concert, I have to chuck all my music literacy stuff and just teach it to them by rote. That's where we get ourselves into trouble with practice tracks and rote instruction. It's when it becomes the fallback for when there's not enough time, then our kids will continue to never think that reading is important. If they don't think it's important and relevant and helping them become awesome musicians and helping them become more confident singers, then they won't buy into your program, no matter what your pedagogy is. I also recognize that there are some types of music making experiences, and I hinted at this before. This is another disclaimer. There are some types of experiences in music where literacy is not important. And so this episode is not meant to demote those other ways of learning music in importance. For example, improvisation is very important. All students in music classes should experience improvisation. Obviously, if the music is not written down prior because it's being improvised, then literacy is not an important skill there, with the exception, of course, the obvious would be some jazz theory type things where if a student is improvising in a jazz style, they would still need to be able to read the chord chart or whatever it is. But I just mean simple exercises in a choir class where students are being allowed to create their own patterns, create their own harmonizations. Those types of things are very important. So this is not meant to be a 100% of the time they should be reading only claim. That's not what I'm saying at all. And also that if kids are learning a gospel piece, for example, and learning it by rote, which is the authentic performance practice, if you will, of that kind of music, kids should experience that. So they should experience improvisation over the course of their curriculum. They should experience rote learning as part of their the curriculum, as part of their toolbox, so to speak, of ways of learning and listening to music. My simple thesis, though, is that those should be relatively peripheral because they require a teacher or to be present for them to be those things to be facilitated. Once they know how to improvise, of course, they can take that one out into the world as well. Okay, so here is where this is the part of the episode looking back on this, because again, it got, I mean, so many teachers have listened to this and responded either very, very positively or very, very negatively. It seems to only go one direction or one of two directions with a lot of my content. But the thing this is where my regret comes in. Was right at this spot. I've listened back to this episode a few times over the years, and I've tried to think about why people got so pissed off by it. But this is the place where I should have emphasized the value of improvisation and rote learning more than I did just there. I suggested that students should have it as part of their toolbox, right? But what I didn't do, and I didn't do a good enough job of, is connecting for the listener, and so I'm going to try to do that now, connecting for the listener how important rote and improvisation are to the development of that sound library that has to happen in our heads before we can read. Okay, so again, this goes back to the way that our brains acquire language. If I am a 5-year-old learning to read a language off of a page, it is assuming that I have all my functioning senses, it is assumed that I will have heard the sounds of that language quite a bit, and I will have spoken the words of that language quite a bit, to the point where I've worked out my muscle coordination of my articulators, my lips, tongue, and teeth. I've heard my parents say those words. I've heard my friends say those words and make those noises. And so now I'm ready to be taught that the symbol TH together sounds like th, because I'm used to hearing that sound. Now, keeping in mind, there are languages all over the planet that don't use the TH sound. And so you can even get into adulthood and especially into adulthood, where you're trying to learn a language that has the th sound in it, but you didn't grow up natively hearing those sounds, that particular sound, and those people will still find it very, very difficult to make that sound. Why? Because we have to have sound before we can have sight. So in this part of the episode, I was so focused on like getting to the part of the episode that's coming up where I'm going to lay out steps, step by step, how to teach your students how to do these things. And I was thinking about that, but I didn't think enough about making sure that it was clear that when I say no, improv is not bad, no, rote is not bad, even practice tracks, there are places and times where those things are reasonable and good supplements to instruction. But the reason we need them, the reason we need those other ways of instruction is to build that sound library. And for the same reason, we need 5-year-olds to know those things. We would not accept in any other language reading skill, we would not accept the following things as a substitute for literacy. We would not accept for a 5-year-old learning to read. Well, they can't really read the words off the paper, but they can sure have a great conversation. And that's what we say when we are saying, well, they can't read. We're not teaching them to read music in music class, but they can sure improvise. Okay, that's great that they can improvise, but then we are only teaching part of the language. In 2024, a literate, fluent person of a language, which should be expected to be able to not only be conversational in that language, but they should be able to read it and write it. And that's how we put together a comprehensive literacy for students. And again, I understand that everybody's going to get to a different point along the continuum here because of where they start and the nature of their programs and where their kids start and the backgrounds of their kids and all of those things. There's going to be a beautiful diversity in that way. But what I'm advocating for is a shared understanding and a shared goal of, are we trying to move them along that continuum to whole language fluency, reading, writing, conversationality, fluency, the ability to hear the language in their head and then describe it afterwards, to hear music and describe it in musical terms. When we reach whole language fluency with our students, those are the types of things that they can do. But the call and response one does keep them dependent on someone providing the information. And so my purpose for this episode is to maybe make the case that the literacy should be the primary method so that the kids can leave us and go off and do it on their own. Teachers will also have to develop their own audiation skills in order to not need the keyboard themselves. With teachers that I talk to about this concept, that is usually the first worry, is that I have never led a rehearsal without notes being played. I don't know that I could. And I said this was actually part of a conversation that you might have heard back in episode 4 with Bradley Ellingbo on this show, where we talked about the conductor being able to develop their own audiation skill to where they can hear the music without it being played and hear it accurately. That is an important skill, and I'll just tell you, take a little side to tell you about my own experience with this. I do not have perfect pitch. I was not born with the ability to look at a score and hear most of the parts happening all at once. That is not a natural ability to me. I've learned it. I've learned how to do it over years of mostly of teaching students without a keyboard. So in the conversation with Brad back in episode 4, one of the claims that I made there was that in the same way that earlier in this episode I said that if a student is singing along with piano being played, they are not really reading. In the same way that if a conductor is listening to the choir singing along with the keyboard on an a cappella piece, for example, they are not actually hearing the score in their head when they give feedback that there's a wrong note or a wrong rhythm. What they're actually doing is they're hearing the discrepancy between the keyboard and the singer, and then stopping and saying, okay, let's fix the mistake, which works in a roundabout way, but it is a crutch in the same way for the conductor as it is for the singer. Am I hearing that it's a G to an E flat in my head, or am I hearing that am I seeing a G to an E flat on a keyboard, hearing two versions of those pitches and hearing that one of them disagrees with the other? Because I would say that a lot of people can hear if a singer is singing one note and the piano is playing a different note, and they will hear that as dissonance, or they will hear that as a discrepancy, and then they will hear that a mistake has been committed. However, if no one is playing the correct note, can the conductor still hear whether or not it's correct? That's what I meant in episode 4 when I was talking about developing that skill for audiation. And guys, I was raised the same way most of you were in choir, where the notes were always being played. So again, I come at this with the experience of, as the polls continue to show, when I run these polls, the vast majority of colleagues are playing the notes. They're having the notes played for kids as they read, right? So I came from that tradition as well. I understand why it is the norm, but I'm gonna, I guess, continue shouting into the wind. And I don't believe it's a coincidence that we talk to people like Carol Krieger on the show, who reports an alarming level of illiteracy at the college music major level. When they get to college, they're not able to identify intervals. These are kids that are most likely the top kids in the programs from around the country at the high school level, because then they're going in to become music teachers, and they're struggling to read because a lot of times in college they will be asked to read a cappella for the first time. I know my own students. I have many music education students that have left my program and gone into college. My students tell me they're bored in their oral skills class. They thank me regularly for the way we learned in high school, because it makes at least one of their classes in college incredibly easy, to the point where they don't have to prepare, and in some ways they're kind of disappointed that it's so boring. And I've heard that reported now for 10 years of former students who go into music education. So it is the norm, and when I say these things, I am saying them from experience of having been raised the way that most of you are delivering your instruction. But I also taught that way for the first 7 or 8 years of my career. So I understand where everybody's coming from. And I had to learn these things the hard way. And I would just encourage you to listen with an open mind. If you've gotten this far, you probably are listening with an open mind. So I applaud you. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead now in this original exercise, or this original episode, to where I actually lay out the steps, and I'm going to see how I feel about those steps in 2024.
Okay, so let's recap some of the principles and some of the steps. You can see here, again, if you're on the YouTube channel, part of the PowerPoint that I've made to go along with this show. If you're not watching on the YouTube channel, I will make the entire PowerPoint available on the Patreon page for subscribers over there so that you can see it. So patreon.com/Choralosophy if you'd like to see the whole resource, or some of the resources, again, are embedded in the YouTube video, so I encourage you to check those out. So let's recap. I've hinted at some of these things before, but the first step is rip off the Band-Aid. Do this tomorrow. Do this in your classes. Get them singing something they've never heard before, a cappella, with only a tonic as a reference. And again, we've already kind of gone over if your situations could all be so different that could look like learning the major scale on the first day. But doing it by reading it off your hands is really, really important. Step 2.
I stand by that still. Choose a level of
music where your students can be successful. Now, this is really important. You don't want your first sight reading experience to be a failure, and that everybody knows it's a failure, including your students. So make it simple enough that they can access it, and this is where framing it for your students.
And again, when I say have their first sight reading experience, for all of you who are playing notes along with them while they sight read, a cappella sight reading experience. If this is their first a cappella sight reading, do music that they can work out on their own, and that you're fairly confident that they can work out on their own. Don't overshoot. Don't overkick your coverage.
As a success is so important, because they need to know that you acknowledge that this is not as exciting as some of the songs we sing at a concert. This is a process that you're going to start so that you can start reading the songs that you do at the concert. This is a long process, and just starting with square one. So it starts with something that you think they can nail on the first try. Include silent singing or audiation into the reading time. This is important also. So as part of your reading, you're giving them the opportunity to first have audiation defined for them as hearing pitches and notes being played in your head. Give them an opportunity to stop and think during the sight reading exercise of what the next note will sound like. That could be a very simple showing a hand sign and then asking them to sing the next hand sign before having heard it, right? Or it could be play some notes on the keyboard and ask them to sign back what they heard. So you're developing the ability to recognize and translate into their heads to that solfege. Number 4, hold firm to the expectation that they can remember and hear pitches in their head. So don't play the tonic a second time. You will be tempted, if this is new for you, is to go to the keyboard and keep reinforcing it for yourself and for the students. But I've never encountered a classroom where somebody in the room didn't remember where the tonic was, so wasn't able to recreate do. Let them know right away that the answer is going to come from somewhere in the class. Even if you get lost track of as the teacher, sometimes might lose where do is. That's okay. Ask the kids. I've talked to many inexperienced teachers at a cappella rehearsals that have talked about this. Like, well, what if I forget where the tonic is, or what if I can't hear it anymore? And I'll always just say, ask the kids, and don't be ashamed of that. Like, somebody in the room is going to remember it. So the trick is, of course, if you feel like you don't want to be embarrassed in front of the kids, just say, who remembers where do is? And make sure it's their responsibility, even if on the inside you're like, oh crap, I can't remember. That will happen from time to time, but your ability to redraw on your pitch memory will just get so much stronger as you do this every day with the kids.
And this, for me, has grown even since I made this recording. This is 5 years ago. I am better at all of these things now than I even was then. These are things that we as teachers will get better at too. Your skill should be growing visibly in front of your students. And that also makes you a powerful model for learning. If they can see you not knowing how to do stuff, but reacting in a way that helps you learn how to do the stuff, you'd be surprised how impactful that can be in an educational environment. So often, we as teachers try to hide all of our flaws from kids. If you can't remember what a pitch is supposed to sound like, and you're the choir teacher, you must be terrible. No, you are simply a normal person that has flaws. And what you're going to show your kids in that moment is, oh crap, my brain just went and I can't remember that. So what are my steps that I'm going to go through to try to get myself back on track? And then there is also the collective. We are a group activity. Does anybody remember where do was? If you are 100% sure, sing it. Somebody will know. Somebody will know. Even if they sing it with the most, it's usually going to be the shy kid. They've got all the music spinning in their head, but they don't want to bring it out into the room. We've all got those kids. And a lot of times that's their opportunity to be the star. All right, you saved us. Good job. Way to go. High five. Those types of things are extremely important. So then I kind of go, and I'll kind of leave my comments here, and then I'll continue letting us listen here to the presentation. But I go in to talk about next into the importance of how they sing. When I released this episode before, I feel like this is the part of the episode that everybody ignored, partly because not everybody listens all the way to the end of something. People wanted these slides. They wanted the step-by-step, and they wanted the quick fix. How do I make my kids sight read better? Lots of people sell sight reading methods. I present this stuff for free, partly because I don't think you can get good at this stuff by reading a blog that does like the top 7 ways to teach your kids to sight read. I don't think it works that way. It is a deep philosophical and scientific study to get yourself to the point where you are a master of how this instruction is delivered. It takes years. And so this is the part people ignored. They wanted to think about sight reading as a reading thing. And how often have I heard, so you're saying we should only teach sight reading? Oh my God, no. It's like people don't listen at all. They want to see the simple version on a meme. But then when we get to what about vocal technique? What about cultural relevance? What about, all of these different things? And I'm like, no. So what happens in a choir that does these things regularly is you have incredibly large amounts of time to do all kinds of other things because they read so quickly and they learn the notes and rhythms so quickly. We have tons of time. But the other thing that it helps us do is vocal pedagogy. It helps us build the voice, because if the singing isn't healthily phonating, probably the best way I would say that, just clear, resonant, unforced singing, non-breathy, well-onset, well-timed onset, those types of things, then the pitches and rhythms are not going to be very accurate anyway. So you're going to have, and this is I think really where my beef with the piano playing along comes from, because it keeps the song going, whether the kids are getting it right or not. So the song can continue. And so what that does is it sets up bad habits. We can sing breathy, we can sing out of tune, we can follow along behind the piano, we can sing the wrong rhythm, the piano will play the right rhythm. An a cappella choir would fall apart, and they would have to stop. They would have no choice. They would have to stop and figure out what just went wrong, and they will have to go back and fix it before they go on. When we sing along with recordings, when we sing along with the piano being played, when we sing along with practice tracks, the song goes on without them, even when they make a mistake, and that's just another lost opportunity for that myelin pathway to be formed, or that neural pathway to be formed, and the myelin sheath to reinforce that neural pathway, we take away one of those opportunities every single time, we just breeze through the section. The idea is that I'm referring to is called deep practice, also found in the Talent Code, which is the book I referenced earlier.
Okay, some principles to adhere to for this to work every day. It's got to be done every day. It's got to be done every single day, and I don't care if you think you don't have time. You don't have time not to do this. This is something that will save you time in the long run, I promise. Sight reading can never be only about the what. Hold them to the how as well. What I mean by that is, the way I define it, is the what of sight reading is the note correct, is the rhythm correct, the end. Try to avoid that kind of sight reading practice, even for beginners. There's always something musical that they could be doing during that time, whether it is adding in a dynamic to the pattern once they've gotten it, adding in some kind of tone quality requirement, as your lingo in your classroom will be different than mine, so you give them some kind of lingo that they understand as a way to affect the tone quality, ask them to sing with that tone quality, so that they're never just being told good job because they unimaginatively and non-beautifully sang a correct notes and rhythms pattern off of a board or off of a piece of paper. Hold them to the how. So one example of how I do that is I require that the students use a balanced onset on every single attempt. And this is one that gets missed by a lot of people, I think. So a balanced vocal onset, I call it being connected to the breath. That's my lingo with the kids at school. But what I'm really talking about is that it's a balanced onset where air is not escaping before the noise starts. So you hear this a lot, especially in young girls, but also young boys if they're deciding not to be very brave. And you hear, ha. And so in that case, what I ask them is I start training them right away. I'll stop them because that was an unacceptable onset, and I'll make them do it again, and I'll ask them, what is the first noise you hear? And then they start to tune their ears to, well, the first noise I heard was actually, and so then we'll talk about the biology and the physiology of that. Well, what happened was air started flowing through your vocal folds. It created a hole between them because the air pushed them apart, and then you tried to fight upstream and get your folds to touch and sing later, and that you can't do it that way. You've got to get the air to start at the same time your brain tells your body to start the pitch. It's a timing. It's a coordinated onset. And so I make them do that from the very, very beginning of the year. And what I've discovered over the years is that it does a lot of things for their vocal technique because it builds those habits in, but it also does wonders for their ability to sing the notes and rhythms accurately.
And we have to stop them when they don't do it right. That's the key. If we just keep singing when it's wrong, they will continue to do it wrong every time.
Which that might be counterintuitive. Like, how could there be a connection between that and the other? Well, this happens all the time. So let's say we're in the key of F and I've got freshman girls, sopranos and altos that are typically, as you know, breathy from about a G to a C or a D oftentimes when they're first starting out. And I've got one group singing do and the other group is supposed to sing so, which would be a C, right? So the group trying to sing the C frequently will actually sing an A and call it so, even though that's me. And so what I'll do is, if it's a breathy, air-escaping tone, is I won't even address with them that they sang the wrong note. I will address with them how they were singing. I'll ask them, what did that sound like? They'll say, oh, it was breathy. Do you know how to fix that? Yes, I know how to fix that. So let's fix that. Now sing so. And by coordinating their onset, in almost every case, the C comes out next, and not the A. And I didn't even address the wrong note. Well, that happens because they are now singing with enough resonance where they can control the pitch. And so in the first instance, when they sang an A, their brain believed their body and took them to a place that was comfortable with their current method of phonation.
And I go on to explain the reason that this feedback has to come like right away. And again, I mentioned this before, but if we're playing along, we're oftentimes, if we're the only teacher in the room and we're the ones playing along, it's even worse. Because then we're not listening. We're not listening to all those issues, and we can't pounce. And I don't mean pounce in a negative way, but we have to get to the feedback while the mistake is fresh in their mind, or else they don't retain the ability to fix that mistake as easily. They need to fix it in the moment. They need to know what it feels like to go do to so instead of do to me, and they need to also know how easy it is to make that mistake. And they have to feel that fix. Like, we give them that opportunity to feel that fix. And what's also really important when we pounce is that we are pouncing with the model of positive feedback in our mind. Okay, so let's talk about what positive feedback means. Positive feedback does not mean good job. Positive feedback means, what are you going to do now? And so we think about positive feedback as opposed to negative feedback. Negative feedback would be things like, don't do that. Don't do that again. Ooh, don't sing that note. Don't sing that rhythm. That's negative feedback, and it's almost useless in an educational environment. What did you sing there? What are you going to... Oh, I sang the wrong rhythm. What are you going to sing instead? Oh, I'm going to hold it longer, or I'm going to... Actually, I held it too long, so I'm going to hold it shorter. Whatever it is. I'm being, obviously general. But the point is, if positive doesn't mean inflating of your ego. Positive simply means action-oriented. What am I going to do differently? And so if our feedback can be that way, then students will start to do that for themselves as well. And then we get to the ultimate point. I'm not going to go back to episode 18. I think you ended up just now hearing about, 2/3 of it. And I was moving it at a little bit like a 1.25 speed so we could get through more of it. But I'll let you go and listen to the end if you're inspired to do that. But really, this was intended to be an update to that episode so that I could add some thoughts and also hopefully expose these ideas to a more recently joined part of our audience who have not had a chance to have this conversation. So the reflection on that episode really for me is that there are a few things that I would have said differently. We went over some of those, and there are a few details I would have added to make the context more vivid. But I think ultimately, the thing that I learned the most from this is that, from the feedback from you all, is that there is a difficulty in communicating the idea that I really do hold, and it's a genuinely held idea, that we have all learned how to do this wrong, and that for generations we have been teaching music incorrectly. And there's really no good way to say that to people in a way that's not going to offend some percentage of them. But I don't think of it as, you're dumb, how dare you teach this way. Like, I don't have any malice in my heart when I say those things. I'm saying this from a point of activism, of we need to figure out a way to spread updated information. If we don't know how the brain works, we should imprint some of those concepts onto how we teach everything that we teach, not just music, and we should be looking for it in data. Okay, so if the end goal is that we are improving the quality of music education in the United States and around the world, then we need a discussion about best practices. But I also learned, here's the but I also learned that life is messy and every situation is different. And when I did acknowledge in the episode originally that everybody's situation would look different, but I think even at the time, I was not aware of just how different. And I think that's been the beautiful thing about being the host of the Choralosophy Podcast for these 5 years since that episode, is that I now understand a way more than I used to as I've gone around the country and clinicked different groups and different school districts, helped them with their PD, gone to present at conventions and had a chance to speak with, I've spoken with so many hundreds and probably close to 1,000 colleagues directly. The audience is quite a bit larger than that, but of course not enough of you reach out. So I would love to hear from more of you on the Choralosophers Facebook page at choralosophy@gmail.com, because I've been enriched by these conversations with people who gave me very genuine feedback, even related to that episode those years ago, where people would say, yeah, like I hear what you're saying, and I understand the science of why it's probably right, but in my environment, I can't get away with that because X, Y, and Z. And those conversations have been very illuminating, because it's also caused me to start to think about things like, I outline in this episode the ideal pedagogy in my mind for how all of these ideas and concepts come together. But what if we can't be to the ideal? What if we can't get to that point because of where we are in our life, and AKA what our program is, what our teaching situation is? Then what do we prioritize? What parts of the ideal can we salvage and make it so that our students are still growing towards independent fluency and in growing towards that sense of power that they will feel when we are able to hand them music and walk away and unplug them so that they really understand the music and hear it and feel it in their souls when they dig into their sheet music to try to discover those things. Because ultimately, even all the other modes of learning, like rote, like improvisation, etc., we actually get better at all of those things when we reach whole language, complete language fluency. You actually can't reach that level of fluency without becoming a better rote learner, without becoming a better improviser, without being able to conceive of music on a 3D level. And that is ultimately what we're trying to accomplish. So I hope this little look back into memory lane was helpful for those of you who have been around in the audience for 5 years. And if you have not ever heard episode 18, I just gave you the meat of it. But as I mentioned in there, you can get the various slides that went along with it. If you're a Patreon member, those are still in the Google folder. I'm actually going to create some classroom poster versions of this kind of stuff, which I've never done before. People have been asking for years, but now that I have the choralosophy.com/shop, where people can buy shirts and coffee mugs and handbags that say literacy is equity, you can get sweatshirts and all that stuff, I'm going to go ahead and create some, using the slides that I've done for a variety of presentations. I'm going to start making some wall art, some wall posters, in addition to the one you can see up behind my head if I move. Yep, the thank you for your mistake. I'm going to try to make some educational posters as well to help you and your students remember these steps and also internalize the why for how we approach this instruction. I think you might find it helpful. So I'll announce when that's on. Make sure you are listening on the Instagram, following on Facebook. You'll see when some of these posters come out. My goal is to get through this school year and try to get some of that done this summer so that it's ready to go for you for next school year. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. This was fun. I've never done a debate myself or a recap myself podcast episode before. See you later. Thank you all for listening to this episode. As always, the way that we keep Choralosophy moving into the future. We just hit 5 years, and the way we hit 5 more years and continue to grow and expand, the way that this platform can be valuable to you, the listener, and can continue to be valuable to the music education landscape is you being involved. The ways that you can be involved, of course, are entering the Choralosophy promo code at all the websites that allow that. They are amazing partners that have been with us mostly since the beginning. That's SightReadingFactory.com, MyMusicFolders.com. That is also EndeavorPublishing.com and GraphitePublishing.com. You can also, of course, go over to Ludus and check out their products. You can do the things directly for the show that help, like go to patreon.com/Choralosophy and chip in $3 a month. And if you can't do any of those things, I just want you to join the conversation. So head on over to the Choralosophers Facebook page, like, share, leave comments anywhere that you're able to see the content. Those help other people see the content and join the conversation as well. We are building a movement here, and we want you to be a part of it. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.